what this bill will do.
Health and just may have changed if you
around ideas with. So, Mr. Hancock, you appear to be making a habit of coming third these days. So, Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but I'm honoured to be third today, let's see how that goes. But it's also a pleasure to be here and to be clean and well fed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the best way to spread opportunity and reduce inequality in society is by providing every person with a world-class education. These are not my words, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but they're the words of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I passionately agree with them. I agree with him that this should apply to all, and my bill represents the next step in turning these strong words into action. I'm delighted that the bill has cross-party support. Indeed, in its gestation, it has support from all sides of the House, from the member for Chingford, for instance, to the member for Hayes and Harlington, and indeed that cross-party support includes members like the member for Bury South, who have been on both sides of the House themselves since this bill was first put together. I firmly support the government's approach to increase rigour and improving standards in our schools. That is at the heart of what this bill will do. That drive over a decade is raising standards, and with raised standards comes raised opportunity and hope for children, and we've seen that improvement, especially in the most deprived parts of our land. And now the government's explicit goal is even greater literacy. Earlier this year, the then Secretary of State, I think it was the last Secretary of State but I've slightly lost count, he put 100% literacy at the heart of the schools white paper and the SAND review. He was right to do that. And I would be grateful for confirmation from the Minister on the continued support for these two incredibly important planks of education policy, the schools white paper and the SEND review. But there is a gaping hole in the government's literacy drive, because shockingly, 1 in 5 dyslexic children get identified in school, just 1 in 5. These are on the department's own figures. And in fact, when I found these figures from the Rose Report over 10 years ago, I then asked the department through parliamentary questions what the updated figure was, because I thought 1 in 5 was such a shockingly low figure. And I found that it hasn't changed over the last decade. Only 1 in 5 dyslexic children get identified at school. But without early identification, we will never reach full literacy, because the success in driving up literacy requires us to next support those who have the most difficulty in increasing their literacy. So the next stage of the education revolution under this administration must be to improve opportunities that dyslexic children and children with other neurodivergent conditions have. It's estimated that around 10% of people in the UK are dyslexic. But if we don't know who's dyslexic when they're at school, how can we possibly help them and equip them with what they need to deal with the challenges that life throws at us? Now, having been Health Secretary, I make an analogy to a health condition. If you have a heart condition, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if you don't know you've got the problem, you can't get the support to sort it out. And this is at the heart of what we need here to ensure that we have early identification. Screening in medical intervention is absolutely standard and valuable. And that way we can help people to live healthy, improved lives. So too it is with dyslexia. And my bill today would result in every child being screened for dyslexia in primary schools and giving teachers the adequate level of training to be able to teach dyslexic children properly. I think it is an outrage that whilst every teacher is a teacher of a dyslexic child, Teachers currently do not need to be trained to support dyslexic children. That needs to change. This leaves thousands of dyslexic children left in the classroom without the world-class education they've been promised. And this fact that only 1 in 5 is identified at school means that many leave school not knowing that they've got a specific condition that affects how they translate those letters on a page into sounds in their head, but instead, dyslexic up and down the country are called lazy or stupid. And the worst is this undermines their self-esteem. And the problem with that is that they label themselves. Now, I was once told that we don't want to label children as dyslexic because they might feel downtrodden by that. But I can tell you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from personal experience, that once you have found out what the problem is as a dyslexic, first you can get the support. And in my case, when I was identified as dyslexic age 18, after I'd left school, I then got the support to essentially relearn how to read. And that allows me to stand here reading from a little piece of paper whilst speaking it out in a way that I simply wouldn't have been able to before I got that support. But it's not only the practical support we need, it's making sure you know what the problem is. Because I know, and dyslexics who have that dyslexia identified know, that the problem is a specific neurological one of this translation of letters that wobble around slightly on the page into how it sounds in your head. It is not that you're bad at languages or stupid in some way. And there are still thousands of children who label themselves that because they do not get the identification that they need. This has got to change. And it is wrong to say that labeling children is a mistake. On the contrary, ensuring children know what the problem is gets them support and helps improve their self-esteem. Yes, of course.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. And is it right that for some people who have been identified as dyslexic, they are able to get particular help, extra time, for example, in taking their exams? And if they're not identified as dyslexic, they won't be able to take advantage of that?
My honourable friend brings me immediately onto the next page of my speech, and I know that he's extremely experienced in the work on these private members' bills on a Friday, so much so that he can anticipate precisely the next point I was going to make, because the current system is broken, because identification as dyslexic requires on expensive tests that only a few children do, and there is a very strong correlation between being able to access those tests and the means of one's parents. And the result of that is that there is a much higher rate of identification in the private school system than in the state school system. In the state school system, 2.2% of people are identified as having special learning need. In the private school system, 18% have an education and healthcare plan. The divergence between those two figures cannot possibly be explained by a difference in the nature of the children. It is all about access. And in this country, for over 100 years, we've had a universal access to schooling. Quite rightly, it is the basis of a fair society and equality of opportunity, but we do not have equal access to identification for dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions. And as a result, it isn't just that we have a problem of accessing the extra time that might be appropriate, but we have an essentially unfair system of allocating that extra time, because if you can afford to get the identification, you get the extra time, and if you can't afford to get the identification, you don't get the extra time, and that is a social outrage, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is not only an issue of morality, but it's also an issue of social and economic justice. And I'll just make this point very gently, and it relates to the previous bill. Over half of prisoners are thought to have dyslexia. Yes. And over half of successful entrepreneurs are thought to have dyslexia. So if you are dyslexic, your life can go two ways. If you get the support you need, if you become successful, you often are more creative. There is more lateral thinking amongst dyslexics, not least because you have to think around problems like how to read something on a page. But people who don't get the support can end up in a life of crime too often. The 2012 Dyslexia Behind Bars programme found that when prisoners were taught to read, the reoffending rate dropped by 5.9% within 4 years. But sadly, over the last decade, as Ofsted and Inspector of Prisons reported earlier this year, there has been no progress in literacy in prisons, and their report was one of the most upsetting I have ever read. A dry government document should not be as upsetting as that is, and it describes precisely the problem that the failure to have the measures in this bill leads to. It's not all doom and gloom. There's also a massive opportunity. Dyslexic people tend to have skills that jobs increasingly need and the future jobs need. Creativity, lateral thinking, enhanced communication skills, especially oral communication. Computers increasingly do the boring straight line thinking. Dyslexics have brains fit for the future. No wonder progressive employers like GCHQ and Universal Music and Deloitte proactively hire neurodivergent people. But if dyslexic people do not know they have these talents, if they're not identified and they don't get the support they need, then they cannot make the most of these advantages. One further point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on why there might be objections to this bill. I have heard some people say that you don't want more false positives. You don't want to over-identify children who aren't dyslexic. But this bill is very carefully written to take that into account, because it is calling for screening for all. It isn't calling for all to take a formal test. The purpose of the screening is to get better data. We have an excellent phonics test in primary schools, which is very good at identifying how good children are at turning the phonic symbols on the page into the sounds in their head. But the measure of a dyslexic brain is the gap between that capability and your ability at languages, because most dyslexics are good at oral languages. They've got the gift of the gab, a bit like me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you might say. But if they are good at that but poor at the phonics test, that identifies a different problem to if you're bad at the phonics test and bad at languages, when you need a different type of support. It is this gap that I'm trying to address, and by having a test of language ability alongside the phonic ability in primary school, we will find those who we know have the intellectual capability. They've got the wherewithal. They've just got a specific neurological problem that means that they need support to get across through this barrier. This bill will help to address that problem. It will make sure, of course, in 1 second, it will make sure that the government has what it needs to implement a system that can make sure we take the literacy that we need to see to the next level, because if 10% of children are dyslexic, then there is no way we can reach that full literacy without just to doubt who they are and to address it. And with that, I'll happily give way.
I thank my right honourable friend, who is making an excellent speech, and I'd just like to thank him for shining such a bright spotlight on this area and setting out the opportunities for neurodivergent people. Increasing the educational outcomes and employment outcomes is a huge priority for me. I know he is a passionate campaigner, and I just wanted to put on record my gratitude to him and the willingness to work with him further on this issue.
Well, I'm grateful for that willingness. Passing the bill would be a good, a good starting point. But she's right also that there is good work ongoing, especially in the SEND review. But the critical point is the early identification and the rejection of the false argument that has been put to me, including by some in her department, that it is a bad idea to identify problems. You need more data in the classroom to know how children work. And the best outcome would be that some children, you would identify the dyslexia, you would give them the support, and they would close the gap between their phonic ability and their language ability in the same way my gap was closed. And I can now read long words off a piece of paper and read perfectly effectively to be able to hold down a half-decent job. Yes, of course.
I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and also to say how much I admire his campaign on dyslexia. Could he say a little bit about what actually happened from his own personal point of view at the age of 18, why he didn't get the support that he needed before that age, and what actually sparked that? Because I think that would be of interest to people in terms of addressing this debate.
Yeah. Well, I'm incredibly grateful for that question. I know others want to speak, but what happened to me was that I was fortunate in that I'm okay at maths. so I could get to university on my maths. Or I specialised in maths-based subjects, in maths and physics and computing at A-level and economics. I arrived at university to do an essay-based degree. And by the end of my first term, my tutor, Dr. Michael Hart at Oxford, he took me to one side and he said, you can talk, but you can't get it down on paper. And he said, you should go and get identified. Now, I was lucky. I was at one of the best universities in the world. They had a brilliant education department, and they essentially retrained my brain in how to read, took me back to the phonics, and now I learn each word, and I look at a word essentially as a picture. It means I can read normal words quite well. I'm not that good with brand new words, and I have to concentrate very hard to learn them. But that gave me the ability to prosper both at university and then succeed afterwards. It didn't stop all the screw-ups, and I have some terrible stories of errors, including when I accidentally wrote a political election address for the then member for Guildford in the 2001 election, and managed to write in very large letters across the front, I want to untie the community. I intended to say, I want to unite the community. Unfortunately, we only discovered this error when the election address had landed on the 40,000 mat, and my still good friend, the former member for Guildford, was here no longer. So my dyslexia has continued to cause some problems for me and caused a problem for him, but I hope that he's forgiven me. I want to just put on the record, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my thanks to the British Dyslexia Association, to Made by Dyslexia, who campaign for the benefits of, to explain the benefits of dyslexic thinking, and for Neurodiversity in Business, who campaign for businesses to open their minds to people who think differently. These are superb campaigning organisations, but there is more that needs to happen here. The choice is very simple. We must not leave generations of dyslexic children without identification or the support they deserve. We can back this bill and end systemic discrimination against neurodivergent children in our education system. If you, like me, care about every child actually receiving a world-class education, there is no good reason to reject this bill. For decades, governments of all colours have failed dyslexic children and put this in the too difficult box. Today, we have the opportunity to right that wrong. And this bill will improve literacy, increase economic growth, and reduce crime. Now is the time to stop talking and start delivering.
Question is that the bill be now ready. Second time, Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I start by saying how good it is to see the right honourable member here in the flesh. He may have felt at home the last few weeks amongst late career pop stars and soap legends, but it is, I'm sure, what he's hoping to do here far more important than the last few weeks. I thought he was very cool in channeling his inner Arnie, although I'm not so sure he'll be back. Maybe that's one for the government, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In all seriousness, I know the topic of this bill is close to his heart, and I say it, in seriousness, he has campaigned long and hard to raise the awareness of dyslexia and neurodivergent conditions. As was made clear earlier, his campaign is as much a personal one as a political one, and for that I commend him. The British Dyslexia Association, as he was saying, estimates that between 10 to 15% of people in the UK are dyslexic, whilst around 6% suffer from dyscalculia. I think we are all committed to ensuring that neurodivergence shouldn't be a factor that holds children back from achieving their potential. We know that with early intervention and the right support through their education, children with dyslexia can succeed at school. Yet all too often, lack of access to diagnosis and support creates multiple problems. An estimated 4 in 5 young people are leaving school with their dyslexia unidentified, thinking that they just find reading and writing hard. This can hold back pupils' grades, particularly in exam-based assessments, and affect their confidence and mental health. We need to prioritise earlier intervention and quicker support, as the Right Honourable Member was saying. Those with dyslexia clearly feel differently to their peers, and many dyslexic children show strengths in lateral thinking and creative skills. It is vital that these skills are nurtured and encouraged alongside the additional support children need with their reading and writing. Steve Jobs, Stephen Hawking, Abraham Lincoln were all recorded as having dyslexia. Their individual contributions were immense, despite being outliers and often going it alone. Whilst it is true that teachers and school staff across the country work hard all year round to support their students, a staggering 59% of teachers believe there is no appropriate training in place for all teachers in supporting pupils with SEND. So I understand the Right Honourable Gentleman's efforts to try and change the statute book to address this glaring deficiency in our education system for neurodivergent children, but do wonder if additional legislation is necessary in this form. I sense that with perhaps more engagement with this side and with the Department for Education, the Right Honourable Gentleman could well have sought to focus his energy reforming the system as it stands, but more broadly. Labour is just as committed to the agenda as he is. Indeed, our National Excellence Programme, funded by ending the tax breaks for private schools, would provide a £210 million teacher development fund. This would ensure teachers have access to appropriate ongoing training for SEND, including dyslexia, at every stage of their career through existing channels. And whilst Labour support the underlying thrust of this bill and sympathise with its aims, we believe this is better delivered through trainee teacher continuous professional development programmes. This will allow trainee teachers to develop an understanding and awareness of a range of neurodivergent conditions, not just limited to dyslexia. With that in mind, and without wishing to delay the House further, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do think it's worth asking the Minister what steps she is taking to ensure the principle behind the bill is noted in the improvement plan for SEND Green Paper. And as I'm sure the Right Honourable and Honourable members will be aware, the government had committed to publishing the improvement plan by the end of the year, but has since delayed it until after the new year. So I would therefore ask the Minister if she could indicate when she expects this to be published, given the stresses many parents of SEND pupils have to cope with in the current SEND system. Mr. Deputy Speaker, many of the harrowing cases I hear about on my constituency surgeries, and it's weekly, are really worried about the SEND system as it currently operates. We should all feel an imperative to break down the administrative hurdles making the lives of parents and neurodivergent children and pupils harder. For that reason, Mr. Deputy Speaker, whilst I admire the Right Honourable Member's attempts to bring this legislation through, indeed, like him and so many others, my brother suffered greatly through a lack of early diagnosis. That said, I do not believe this bill is the answer in the way it currently sits. What I think is needed is better diagnosis across all education and all neurodivergent conditions. And we believe this can be done through continuous professional development. So with colleagues on this side, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do look forward to seeing how this bill develops and to hear from the Minister.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Mr. Deputy